We adore our guest speaker this morning, and I was actually on the committee that worked for her when she was appointed to take Martin Nesbitt's seat, and we were just all so tickled about that. I'm going to just very briefly share some committees with you. I have no glasses, and it's very small print, but it's sufficient really to say she's quite important. She serves on the Appropriations of General Government and Information Technology. Oh, thank you. Healthcare, Judiciary, Redistricting, Rules and Operations of the Senate, Select Committee on Elections, Select Committee on Judicial Reform, Redistricting, and many, many more, Transportation. But one thing that David shared with me this morning that he had gotten that really touched me was a quote from our senator, which says, "What motivates me to do the work that I do is that I will never forget how I got here. I am the product of good public policy. I am the product of great public education, and that's why it's important to me to stand up for everyday people." She is the oldest of 8 children, and I think we should stop right now and pause and recognize that her father is here with her this morning, and I know that he comes with her anytime he can. So we would like to recognize Terry's dad, and thank you so much for being here with us this morning. And along that line, when she was reelected in 2016, she went off and got herself elected the Democratic whip. And we're very, very proud of that. We're glad you're here. I am particularly glad you're here. If you would come and take this one. Got one-way traffic here. It's like Hendersonville.
Anyway, I just want to thank you all for being here. I want you to know that this job has been the privilege of a lifetime. I love it, and I am so grateful to all of you for giving me the opportunity to do it, and I hope you'll vote for me again, even though I did stand you up that one morning. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about the amendments, and I'm going to talk about them individually, but first I'd like to remind you of the context in which they were written, because I don't just want you to vote no on these amendments. I want you to go to the polls outraged about the steady attacks on democracy that have been perpetrated by a Republican supermajority. I want you to go to the polls angry that these amendments are even on the ballot, and I want you committed to do everything in your power to make sure they're defeated. For as long as I have been in the General Assembly, Republicans have been rigging the system so that they can hold on to power. The extreme gerrymandering after 2010 was just the beginning. Now, we all remember the 2016 election. It was pretty bleak for Democrats, but there were some bright spots. In North Carolina, a Democratic challenger defeated a Republican incumbent governor.
Yes.
Thank you so much for everything you did to elect Roy Cooper. But as soon as he was elected, Republicans changed the rules. While serving under a lame duck governor who would rubber stamp their actions, Republicans called a special session to abruptly take away Governor-elect Cooper's ability to put together the team that would work with him. Hundreds of key positions were reclassified so that Republicans could remain in place to do the legislature's bidding. Once Roy Cooper was in office, the budget for the democratically elected Attorney General was slashed by 30% because he was a Democrat and seen as an ally of the governor. The Department of Environmental Quality was cut, not for the first time, but yet again, because someone who cared about the environment was in the governor's mansion. The power to police lobbyists was taken away from the Democrat Secretary of State, Elaine Marshall. We can only speculate why they would do something like that. And because the new superintendent of schools was now a Republican, the legislature transferred power to him from the State Board of Elections, a move that provoked the Republican chair of that board to sue. The Board of Education, in fact, was so outraged by the power grabbing of the new superintendent that 3 Republican members resigned so that Governor Cooper could name their replacements. And that's not all. Through their power of appointment, the Republicans in the legislature have made the UNC Board of Governors so partisan that former members from both sides of the aisle have come together to protest. And it's not just the governor who's been undermined. Last session, the most important piece of legislation passed by the General Assembly, the budget, was added to a conference committee report rather than being introduced as a bill. Now, a conference committee is only convened to reconcile the differences between 2 versions of a bill that have already passed the House and the Senate. It is never used for new legislation. Nevertheless, a conference committee was convened while without a single Democrat from either the House or the Senate. Deliberations were done behind closed, guarded doors. That would be illegal if the county commissioners or our city council did that. There was no opportunity for Susan or John or Brian or I, your elected officials, to provide input. But more importantly, there was no opportunity for you to make public comment and have your voice heard. Once the budget moved to the floor for a vote, because it was a conference committee, amendments were not allowed. Now, the budget is filled with policy that affects every man, woman, and child in North Carolina. Think about that. How can we say we are democratic? How can we say we are a free people if the people we elect to represent us are prohibited from doing their job? And the attacks on the independent judiciary have been even more relentless. After 10 years of successful implementation, public funding for judicial races was repealed, allowing big money to influence our fair and impartial courts. Republicans passed a law providing for retention elections for the Supreme Court. Now, that was designed to protect incumbents, 3 incumbents, that were going to be up for re-election in the next 3 cycles. That bill, though, was repealed as unconstitutional. North Carolina became the first state in over 100 years to make judicial elections partisan, and therefore making our courts less independent. And despite widespread opposition, Republicans reduced the Court of Appeals from 15 judges to 12 judges because they wanted to stop Governor Cooper from filling 3 vacancies that would become available during his term. A Republican judge resigned early in protest so that Governor Cooper could appoint his successor, Judge John Arrowood, who we need to get reelected. Yeah. And don't forget the year-long attempt to gerrymander our judicial districts. Somehow, only progressive judicial districts got subdivided. Eventually, that move, had it been successful, would have cost us half of our progressive judges. And finally, because they said they needed more time to redraw those judicial districts, Republicans eliminated judicial primaries even for statewide races. Now, that was supposed to result in an advantage for the Republican incumbent running for the North Carolina Supreme Court. They assumed she would run alone against a large field of Democrats, splitting the Democratic vote. That plan backfired because we have such a clearly outstanding candidate in Anita Earls. Other Democrats stayed off the ballot, except for one who wanted to give moderate Republicans a choice. And so he switched his affiliation and is running as a Republican. But we're going to elect Anita Earls. So year after year, I've watched Republicans pass laws that limit democracy. Remember the monster voter suppression law? Amendment 1, the motorcycle safety bill that ended up severely impacting women's access to abortion. Year after year, the courts have said no, overturning 14 of their laws. And year after year, the Republican response has been retribution against our courts, against the governor, and against the people of North Carolina. That is the context you need to understand to fully get the purpose of these amendments. The Constitution is a sacred document. Amendments, when necessary, should be carefully considered, the result of studies, hearings, and careful drafting and redrafting before they appear on the ballot. Nothing like that occurred with any of these 6 proposed amendments. They were rammed through the General Assembly by a majority party with no meaningful hearings or debate. The wording of some of these amendments was so dishonest, the courts said they had to be rewritten. The enabling legislation for any of them that pass will be written after the election to further hide their real intent from the voters. Which gets me to the details. I'm going to do these in the order they will appear on the ballot. And first is the hunting and fishing amendment. Now, when I asked in committee, what are the impediments to hunting and fishing in North Carolina? No one, particularly not the bill sponsor, could give me a straight answer. There are no impediments to hunting and fishing in North Carolina. So I urge you to vote no. The Victims' Rights Amendment. What I have learned, unfortunately, since this was briefly debated, is that we already have robust protections for victims in our Constitution. This amendment will expand access to information related to crime, including the right to confer with the prosecutor. It would also expand victims' rights to a wider range of cases, but it would cost our courts approximately $30 million a year, money which has not been appropriated and therefore is an unfunded mandate. And it would cause further delays to an already overburdened justice system. It also will include crimes committed by juveniles. And what we know about young people is that their brains, although they can tell the difference between right and wrong, sometimes lack that impulse control. And we need to make sure that our system gives them every opportunity to get their lives on the right path. And this amendment, I believe, would hurt those efforts. So I urge you to vote no. Next is the state income tax cap amendment. Now, North Carolina current tax rate for individuals is just over 5%, and the tax rate for corporations is 3%. And this amendment wouldn't affect that because it sets the cap at 7%. But consider what would happen if we have a crisis, like an economic downturn, which is, let's face it, inevitable. What it does is it keeps us from raising the income tax so that we may have to go to other kinds of taxes, like sales taxes or property taxes. So this is just one more effort in a years-long effort to shift the tax burden from people who can afford to pay taxes and corporations to working North Carolina families. And so for that reason, I urge you to vote no. And then there is the voter ID amendment. Now we know how horrible this is because we actually tried it already. In 2013, we passed a voter ID requirement. 2.3 million people voted under that law in 2016 in the primary. Four people were turned away because their faces didn't match their IDs. However, 2,300 voters showed up at the polls lacking an ID. Can you imagine? Their ballots were set aside for review. Senator Richard Burr was among them. He had to cast a provisional ballot. More than 1,500 of those ballots were not counted. 1,500 ballots were not counted. And just to give you an example, it is just simply not true that everyone has an ID. In Buncombe County alone, 5,405 of our 188,000 registered voters do not have a DMV ID. That's 3% of the voters, certainly enough to change the outcome of an election. Voter ID simply does not stop fraud. Of the 4.8 million people who voted in the 2016 general election, one fraudulent vote was stopped with a voter ID. Only one. Voter ID is discriminatory. We know that. It disproportionately targets women who experience name changes occasionally during their lives, young people who may live here but have because they go to school here and work here but have a driver's license from the place they came from, and people of color. In North Carolina, people of color represent 24% of the population, but 40% of the voters with ID. The courts, when they overturned this law, did so because they found it discriminated against people of color with surgical precision. And finally, I just want to point out that voter ID is expensive. Consider the fact that many rural North Carolinians do not have regular access to a DMV. So the cost of transportation, the cost of taking time off work, the cost of getting a copy of your birth certificate, now that we have real ID, that adds up and represents a hardship for low-income voters. In fact, the Tax and Budget Center estimates the cost for a rural voter between $110 and $140. That is a poll tax. So, I urge you, please, to vote no, and encourage everyone to vote no on voter ID. And finally, we have two totally subversive amendments. And though they might sound reasonable, they are really about taking power away from the governor and moving it to the Republican legislature. All living governors, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, have urged voters to vote no on these last 2 amendments. So the first one, judicial vacancies. although it sets up a commission appointed by all three branches of government to make recommendations to the legislature about which nominees are qualified, the legislature is only required to pass 2 of those names onto the governor. The legislature is the choke point. They will pick the judges. Now, in debate on this bill, Senator Heiss said, you'll love this, he said, since it is the legislature that writes the laws, aren't they really in the best position to determine who should interpret them? Clearly, he was absent during civics class. And even Representative McGrady on the floor of the House said, guys, you know, we got to consider the fact that someday there may be a Democratic legislature under a Republican governor. So you might ask, why are they doing this? Well, I will tell you why they're doing it. Because if it passes, it puts them in the position to pack the Supreme Court. They can add 2 more positions to the Supreme Court and put Republicans in those positions, and we have to stop that. So I urge you to vote no on this. And finally, the last amendment is the constitutional amendment to establish an 8-member bipartisan board of ethics and elections enforcement in the Constitution to administer the ethics and elections law. Now, we already have a bipartisan board of elections and ethics, except that it's a 9-person board with 4 members from each party and 1 independent. And the governor appoints those members. What this amendment would do is remove the independent member, and its purpose is to create gridlock so that this board has no choice but to do the bidding of the General Assembly. We won't be able, for example, to react when someone like Jake champions for the people of Asheville for an additional early voting site that we need. This gridlock will keep the board from responding to his request, and we're so grateful that he did that. So anyway, I hope you understand now, not only are these not a good idea, these are a terrible idea. And we need to send a message to the legislature that they cannot mess with our Constitution. And in closing, I want to tell you, several weeks ago, I was speaking with a group of women in Clay County, all the way west, and after I was finished, this woman came up to me and she said, Terry, if you do nothing else, stand up for democracy. And I urge you, like Carol said, bring 100 people and stand up for democracy and do the right thing by voting no on these amendments. Thank you all for being here and for being so participant.